everybody, welcome to episode 7 of the LitRPG Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to LitRPG. I'm Ramon Mejia, and I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and author interviews. We'll be talking about the LitRPG pre-orders coming up, in addition to new releases and reviews. And of course, in new releases, we'll be talking about The Land, The Swarm, Digital Shadows, the Dungeons, Town, and Game On, starting the game. We're going to begin with, of course, the upcoming LitRPG. An upcoming LitRPG available for pre-order. The first one coming up is on October the 19th. It's going to be Going Rogue, Spells, Swords, and Stealth, Book 3. This is the third book. I call it the NPC series because that's the name of the first book in the series, NPC. It's a fun story about the NPC characters in a role-playing game kind of becoming, I don't want to say self-aware, but becoming the heroes of their own stories when the player characters die suddenly. And, you know, they kind of take their place in the storyline. So it's a fun story. They've gone on several adventures. I'm a huge fan of the very first book. Book 2 kind of matched. It didn't quite equal the story, but it was a good, fun story. I'm looking forward to seeing Book 3. Dungeon Crawl LitRPG Adventure, the Crucible Shard Book 1 is coming out November the 17th as a new entry into the LitRPG genre. It's an entirely new series. Again, it's new, so we don't have any news about it or if it's good or bad, but I'm definitely looking forward to picking something up. Homeland Ingame 2, second book in the Ingame series. That's coming out November the 19th. If you're a fan of that series, you're definitely going to want to pre-order that one. And of course, as a recent addition to the pre-order list, we have The Way of the Outcast, Mirror World Book 3, coming out December the 19th. It had been just announced this week that this one is coming out. I know it's already under translation. The author must have just barely finished writing it. So look forward to that one. We talked to the author of that particular book not too long ago about his novel and his series too. Of course, you can check out his author interview on our webpage at LitRPGpodcast.com under the recommendation section, author interviews, or it's on the front page. So you can check it out there. Now on to new releases and reviews. Now, the first book that we're going to be talking about that has recently been released is going to be The Land, Swarm, Book 5 of the Chaos Seat series, written by Alarong Kong. Again, this is the fifth book in the series, and it picks up right after the end of Book 4. At the end of Book 4, our hero, Richter, was heading off to face a rock giant, which had previously killed and squashed him. And he was taking along his war party. So this time, you hope he does better. Won't spoil the fight scene for you, but it does start off on a very action-oriented point for the storyline. And it continues on from there. There's a lot of great crafting, a lot of great skill management, village management stuff, interesting story arcs that come from the Mist Village itself, of course. So I'm only about a third of the way through the book personally. So I can't tell you the entire thing. Couldn't spoil it if I wanted to, but I'm definitely loving what I'm reading so far. It's definitely another great entry from Alarong Kong into the series, and it's one of my favorite LitRPG series overall. Love talking to Alarong, and I love reading his books, so good job, buddy. From what I read from reviews from other people, though, this book also leaves off on a cliffhanger. But rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, from what I've talked to Alarong before about in our other interviews, he has plans for like 20 books in this series. So I don't think he's going to be, leaving you unsatisfied when he comes out with book 6. And again, this one is probably the longest book in the series so far. So good job on that, Alarong, and I definitely encourage anyone to pick this up, either as a purchase or as a read on Kindle Unlimited. Next book, Psy-Hunters by Bellart Wright. This one is a sort of science fiction, not quite fantasy, but there are some magical psychic elements to it. The basic storyline comes in along two threads here. There's a man named Troy Hardwick. He has a couple of nephews he's playing a new video game with called Psy-Hunters. It's a virtual reality game. You put on a helmet, have some wands kind of thing. It's not full immersion until like later on in the story. But It's set in the video game is set in a futuristic dystopian universe where aliens have come and experimented on humanity and taken them over and given them abilities like psychic abilities through genetic manipulation, or android bodies, or cyborg abilities. And so it's a very much a shooting laser gun robotic kind of world. And so within that video game story, there's some interesting story arcs, adventures, action scenes, very well developed game mechanics, which I definitely appreciated. Now, the second part of that story is I want to say not quite as satisfying, but definitely more mature storyline. The main character's ex-girlfriend has killed herself, and he has to deal with that loss and that trauma and that feeling of survivor guilt that is inherent within that kind of situation. And the author does a really good job of describing the variety of emotions that comes from that type of reality and those actions. The main character suspects that her suicide is not what it seems to be, and that it may have been, forced, might be not suicide at all, might actually be a murder. Or something else is mysterious, and he's delved into this game world that she loved as well. Of course, it happens to be the same world he's already playing, and so that's a secondary storyline within the series. I won't spoil what happens to it, but it goes on for a little bit. Now, those are basically the storylines for this series, for this particular book, and I say they both do pretty well. If I was forced to give a rating for the book, I'd definitely give an 8 out of 10. Some of the action is a little repetitive, like the types of enemies that the main characters fight don't vary a lot. But again, this is supposed to be like the entry level section in the game world, so it's very much the beginning part of that virtual reality video game world where there aren't a lot of variety of enemies. So that's my only complaint of it. I kind of got tired of seeing them fight robots and androids. So that's part of it. At 333 pages, it's a great length. 99 cents right now. Probably an introductory, price for the book. But it's also on Kindle Unlimited, so I definitely encourage you to go pick it up. If nothing else, as a value read, it's a great story, especially for that particular price. And that's kind of it for that one. Next, on to Digital Shadows, a virtual horror action adventure thriller. This is one of the stories I'd meant to review at the end of September, but it kind of got pushed back because of the author interview we did with Michael Antonoff, author of the Perimeter Defense series. The description reads as, Digital Shadow is the latest craze in virtual reality, massive multi-online role-playing games. The game is based on a virtual world of horror, mystery, secret societies, monsters, and shadowy nightmares. And boy, is it. This story is very reminiscent of Resident Evil or of Silent Hill. It's that same kind of fantasy, mystery, survival horror kind of thing. It mixes those types of game mechanics very well with kind of a Lovecraftian feel to the storyline. The main character gets trapped in the story in the video game, and he can't get out. And he has to find a way to survive, because if he dies in the game, he might die in real life. They don't know. But this definitely has that same kind of feel. The monsters feel overpowered, like you have to really try hard to kill them. There's a limited supply of ammo and abilities. It's very well crafted, I have to say. If you love these kind of video games and these stories, you're probably going to enjoy this one. I have to say my level of horror that I enjoy is probably different than a lot of people. I'm not a huge horror fan, but even I enjoyed this one. It is kind of gory, it is kind of graphic in the descriptions of mine, but that goes along with the horror genre. Aside from a few spelling errors and grammar, there's nothing that really pulls away from the enjoyment of the story. It's a really well-paced story, and the author really does a good job of keeping a level of tension and suspense throughout the entire story, which is very difficult to me. Usually there are peaks and valleys of that kind of thing, but in this case, the author continued that same level of tension, even when there's not fighting in the video game world portion of it. Just the exploration portion of the world is very tense sometimes, and that perfectly mirrors what happens or what should be happening in a good survival horror game. So if you're a fan of that kind of video game, or you're a fan of horror, this might be the story for you. On to the Dungeons Town, the Slime Dungeon Chronicles, Book 2. The very first book in this series, I absolutely love the Slime Dungeon Chronicles. It's a story about someone from our world who dies or is reincarnated as a dungeon core. And so as a dungeon core, his job to live is to create a dungeon in which adventurers can come in and explore. And if he can kill the adventurers, he gets their essence to create more monsters, create more corridors, traps, whatever the case is. And so it becomes a balancing act between making the dungeon. If you make the dungeon too hard, the powers that be, the nations, will come and destroy the dungeon core because it's killing too many people. And if you make it too easy, you don't get the resources you need to survive and to live and to continue on creating your dungeon. So that part of it, I absolutely adore it. I love the fact that this is a slime dungeon, not a cobalt or undead dungeon. Yeah, the author used the seemingly weakest monsters available, and he made them very interesting and very varied and challenging for the adventurers. A town also pops up around the dungeon called the Dungeon Town. And that's kind of, and there were a lot of bad things that happened in the very first book. They were interesting, great storyline. So I absolutely love the first book. Now, book 2 really takes place as soon as book 1 ends. The first portion of book 2 deals with the consequences of what happened in book 1. So that's the first part of book 2. So you'll definitely want to read book 1 before you read book 2. Otherwise, you won't understand what's happening quite as much. But the first portion of book 2 deals with those consequences, not just in the dungeon, but also within the surrounding town. There are new factions coming in that have different goals that might conflict and cause, conflict and action and, those kind of storylines. And then, of course, things happening with the dungeon. The dungeon improves, changes, things like that. I loved the dungeon parts. I loved seeing Doc and his fairy friends and the characters within the dungeon explore and expand. And it was fun to see how the dungeon changed, the mazes that are created, the different monsters that appear. I love that dungeon creation and management aspect of the story. That's my favorite part. Then there's the other portion of the story, which is not bad by any means. It is just not my favorite. There's a part of the storyline that takes place in the surrounding town. A lot of the characters that aren't in the dungeon, that aren't part of the dungeon team, I don't remember. They're not as important to me, but that doesn't mean they're not interesting. I especially love the fact that the author's bringing in new characters that are a lot more memorable, like the 3 Werebear brothers, who are beastmen, who come to explore the dungeon. They're definitely memorable. That explains the cover picture for those of you who are wondering what was up with that. But a lot of the story does take place outside of the dungeon, in the dungeon town. And the author has said publicly that he plans to do that mix later on in the continuing storyline. Part of it taking place in the dungeon town, part of it in the outside world, of course, and the other part taking place in the dungeon. So I understand that the author needs the room to tell other stories besides the dungeon, because otherwise that's a very limited space in which to craft a story. So I get that, but again, my favorite part is always the dungeon itself. But again, it's a good story. I've enjoyed reading it, and I definitely would recommend it to anyone else who wants to pick it up on Kindle Unlimited. Now on to the last book we're talking about this week, Game On, starting the game. This book is a import. Well, I shouldn't say import. It was originally written on the Railroad and on the online communities. It's a very interesting story, and it has finally arrived on Amazon for anyone who's loved the story to appreciate there as well. I gotta say the cover art isn't amazing, but don't let that put you off. It's still a good story. Again, I haven't read all of it yet, but I can tell you that it's interesting enough to pick up. I'll read you the description for the story. Matthew Barnett tried to warn those around him. The game was going to start soon. Everyone is going to suffer, and most were going to die unless they took some serious steps to prepare themselves for what was to come. Diagnosed as schizophrenia, he was hospitalized for several months until the proper medication could be found to help him control his inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, and he could return back to a normal school life. But what if it was the world that was actually insane and not him? What if he was right? What if it was really time for everyone to get their game on? So again, this from the description, you can see it's interesting if nothing else. I encourage you to go pick it up as a sample if nothing else. But that's going to be it for the podcast this week, ladies and gentlemen. And I definitely thank you very much for taking the time to listen or watch the podcast. And again, we only exist because of you, the community, and your support. And if you want to help support us, you can find out all the ways to do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. And again, we're going to try to line up some more author interviews for you later this month. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the podcast. Remember, folks, to go read some LitRPG.